A secret is a weight that grows heavier the longer it is carried alone. A truth buried beneath a uniform, beneath lowered eyes, beneath the practiced stillness of someone who has learned that being seen is dangerous. In the vast, cathedral-quiet corridors of the Wong estate, where power moved through the air like a current and every surface gleamed with the cold perfection of money that had never needed to justify itself, something was wrong. Noelani felt it the moment she stepped into the meeting room, a wrongness so precise, so deliberate that it had a texture. She could almost touch it. She moved through the space the way she always moved through it, carefully, soundlessly, a woman shaped by years of making herself disappear, carrying a porcelain tea service as though it were the only purpose she had ever been given. The men at the long lacquered table did not look at her. They never did. She was furniture. She was atmosphere. She was the warm cup placed at an elbow without a word, the soft click of a door closing behind her. She had spent 3 years perfecting this particular kind of invisibility, and she wore it now like a second skin over the one that still remembered a different life. But she was not invisible. She was observing from the one position in the room that no one thought to guard, the position of someone no one believed could understand what they were seeing. Her hands, guiding the teapot with the steadiness of long practice, did not reveal the thing happening behind her eyes. The recognition, the cold, rapid calculation of a mind trained for exactly this, to see the thing that was not supposed to be seen, the signal hiding inside the silence. She had been dormant for 3 years, ever since the life she had built was quietly, methodically taken from her, leaving behind this muted, colorless existence of folded linen and averted eyes. But something in that room had just reached across the years and found her. At the head of the table sat Mr. Wong, a man whose stillness did not suggest calm, it suggested the precise, loaded quiet of something that has not yet decided whether to move. His jaw was set, his hands rested flat against a document. He was, by every appearance, in complete control of the room. He had no idea that the room was already gone. The room Noelani rented was just big enough to remind her of everything she no longer had. A single bed pushed against the wall, a window that faced another building's window, a hot plate on the counter and a kettle that took too long to boil. The walls were bare except for a small water stain near the ceiling that she had stopped noticing months ago. It was the kind of room that asked nothing of the person living in it, and that was exactly why she had chosen it. Her maid's uniform hung on the back of the door, black dress, white apron, pressed and ready. She ironed it every evening before she slept, not because anyone would notice, but because it was the one thing she could still control. On the floor of the wardrobe, pushed to the very back behind a pair of worn shoes, sat a shoebox she never opened, but she knew everything inside it by heart. A government ID badge with her photograph, younger, sharper-eyed, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the world rewarded careful work. A commendation letter signed by a department director praising her instincts and her precision. A training certificate in signals intelligence, dated 4 years ago, from a program that accepted 11 people that year out of over 300 who applied. She had been one of the 11. That person felt like someone she had read about once and half forgotten, someone else's story. The stack of brown envelopes on the kitchen counter had been there for 2 months. Government correspondence, return addresses she recognized, names she used to answer to. She had stopped opening them after the 3rd one. Whatever they contained, her response was always the same: silence. Silence was cheaper than a lawyer. Silence kept her below the surface, where the current couldn't reach her. She had learned in the long, hard way that leaves no visible marks that the safest place to exist was somewhere no one thought to look. She picked up her bag, checked the time, walked out. The commute was 40 minutes by bus, and she spent it looking at nothing in particular through the glass. The city moved past her the way cities do when you have stopped being paired of them, busy, indifferent, full of people with places they actually wanted to be. The Wong estate appeared at the end of a private road lined with trees that had been shaped into perfect stillness. The gates were tall and black and opened without a sound. She had walked through them every morning for 14 months, and they still made her feel like she was entering a different atmosphere entirely. Thinner air, stricter rules, a silence that was managed rather than natural. She nodded to the security guard at the side entrance. He nodded back without looking up from his screen. That was the whole of their relationship, and it suited her perfectly. She signed in, collected her assignment sheet, tied her apron, and then, like water finding its level, she disappeared into the morning, quiet, present, and entirely overlooked, exactly as she intended. She had no way of knowing that today would be the last morning that was true. The estate did not show off. That was the first thing Noelani had noticed about it, back on her first day, and it still struck her now every time she moved through its rooms. Wealth that needed to announce itself was a different thing entirely from wealth this old and this sure of itself. Here, everything was simply the best version of what it was. The floors a deep, polished stone that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. The furniture chosen for weight and permanence rather than beauty. The flowers arranged in tall vases without a single petal out of place. Nothing was excessive. Everything was exact. It was the kind of environment that made you instinctively lower your voice. Security was woven into the building the way bones are woven into a body, invisible until you knew to look for it. Cameras positioned at angles that left no corner unobserved. Guards who moved on rotations so smooth and quiet they seemed choreographed. Doors that required 2 separate clearances to open. Noelani had cataloged all of it in her first week, not out of habit, but because some training never fully switches off, even when everything built on top of it has collapsed. She knew the shape of this place the way you know a song you didn't mean to memorize. She was restocking the linen cupboard on the 2nd floor when the visiting negotiators arrived. She heard them before she saw them, the low murmur of professional conversation, the particular confidence in the footsteps of men who were used to being received rather than kept waiting. She moved to the hallway just long enough to collect a used tray from a side table, and in that window of 30 seconds, she observed what she needed to. 3 men. Expensive suits, but not Korean. The cut was different, the posture shaped by a different culture's idea of authority. Briefcases that were too slim to carry much paper, which meant what they carried was either digital or already memorized. They smiled at the estate manager who greeted them. The smiles did not reach their eyes. She returned to her work. By early evening, she had been assigned to the meeting room. She prepared the tea service the way she always did, methodically, without hurry, each cup placed at precise intervals, the pot wrapped to hold its heat. It was the kind of task that looked simple and was actually a study in quiet attention. She had become very good at it. Wong entered the room last. She did not look up directly. She had learned, early on, that looking directly at Mr. Wong was the kind of thing people only did when they had a reason to. Instead, she observed him the way she observed everything, sideways, in pieces, building the full picture from the edges. He was not a tall man, but the room didn't seem to know that. It adjusted around him the moment he crossed the threshold, the way a conversation adjusts when the person everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. His jacket sat perfectly across shoulders that held no tension because he had nothing left to prove. The tattoos at his collar and neck, dark, intricate lines that climbed toward his jaw, did not make him look reckless. They made him look decided. He sat. He opened the document in front of him without looking at it. His eyes moved slowly around the room, checking and filing, the way hers did. Noelani set down the final cup and stepped back against the wall, invisible again, present for everything. She was exactly where she needed to be. She had been in the meeting room for 6 minutes before she saw it. The guests had not yet arrived. Wong had stepped out briefly with 2 of his senior men, leaving the room in that particular held-breath quiet that expensive spaces settle into when no one important is watching. Noelani was doing what she always did in these moments, moving efficiently, adjusting the placement of cups, straightening a chair that was already straight, making herself useful enough to stay and unnoticed enough to be forgotten. She was wiping down the far end of the conference table when something made her stop. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't movement, it was the absence of something. A small, clean irregularity in the smooth line where the table's decorative trim met the underside of the surface. A shadow that was the wrong shape. An edge that sat 1 millimeter too proud of the wood around it. She did not react. That was the first rule of seeing something you were not supposed to see. You did not react. She continued wiping. Her cloth moved in slow, even circles. Her breathing stayed the same. But behind her eyes, something that had been switched off for 3 years quietly powered back on. She knew what it was before she finished the thought. A transmitter. Compact, professionally fitted, designed to look like part of the furniture to anyone who wasn't trained to find it. The adhesive was clean, no residue at the edges, no tool marks on the trim. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing had placed it there recently, carefully, with time to spare. Her cloth reached the end of the table. She straightened up, she walked back to the serving station and began arranging items that did not need arranging, and she did not look at the table again. The meeting began at 7. Noelani stood at the periphery of the room, still and available in the way that good service staff are trained to be. She refilled a water glass once in the first 15 minutes. No one looked at her. She looked at everyone. The negotiator seated directly across from Wong was the one she had noticed arriving, the one whose smile had not reached his eyes. Now, watching him with the full, quiet attention of someone who had once done this professionally, she began to read him like a document. His responses came a beat too slow, not because he was thinking about what to say, but because he was listening to something else at the same time. His eyes, every few minutes, moved to a fixed point just past Wong's left shoulder. Not obviously, not enough for anyone watching casually to notice, but enough. The pauses in his speech had a rhythm to them that didn't match the conversation. They matched a feed. She had spent 18 months in a signals intelligence unit learning to identify exactly this, the specific behavioral pattern of a person wearing an earpiece and receiving live instruction. The micro-expressions, the manufactured hesitations, the eyes that were in 2 places at once. She was not mistaken. She had never been mistaken about this. The room was warm. The tea was fresh. The conversation moved forward in a careful, professional rhythm, and somewhere beneath the table, every word of it was being transmitted to people who were not in the room. Noelani's hands stayed folded in front of her. Her face stayed neutral, but her blood had gone completely cold. She excused herself from the room at the first natural pause, a moment when Wong leaned forward to review a page in the document and the negotiators reached for their water glasses, a shift in the meeting's rhythm that gave her a small, clean window to slip out unnoticed. She made it to the kitchen corridor before her composure began to cost her something. Her hands found the edge of the counter and held on. Not dramatically, there was nothing dramatic about it. It was simply the grip of someone who needed one solid, unmoving thing while everything inside her mind moved very fast. She ran the numbers the way she had been trained to, quietly, methodically, without letting feeling get ahead of fact. If she said nothing, the meeting continued. Wong reviewed the terms, found them acceptable, and signed. The transmitter fed every commitment he made, every figure, every name, every concession to whoever was waiting on the other end of the signal. By the time he realized what had happened, it would already be too late to matter. The trap did not need to be loud to be final. That was one outcome. The other was this. She spoke. She warned him. And in doing so, she answered a question no one in that room had thought to ask. How does a maid know what a Class 3 surveillance transmitter looks like? How does she recognize an earpiece pattern? How does she read behavioral signals with the accuracy of someone who was trained and paid and commended for doing exactly that? She revealed herself, and in a house like this one, belonging to a man like Wong, being revealed as something other than what you claimed to be was not an uncomfortable conversation. It was a different kind of ending entirely. She could be killed for knowing. She could be killed for speaking. The corridor hummed with the quiet noise of the estate's ventilation system. Somewhere deeper in the kitchen, a timer ticked. Noelani stared at a fixed point on the wall and let herself think about her mother. Her mother had raised her in a house where silence was currency. You learned when to spend it and when to save it. Silence kept your father from coming home angry. Silence kept the neighbors from knowing your business. Silence, she used to say, is how we survive. She had believed that for most of her life. She had believed it right up until the moment her own silence, her careful, professional, well-reasoned decision to wait for the proper channels, to trust the process, had been used to bury her. No one had needed to shout her down. They had simply waited for her to stay quiet, and then they had built the lie in the space she left. Silence was sometimes survival. Her mother was right about that, but she was old enough now to know the part her mother hadn't said, that silence was also sometimes the thing that finished you slowly, from the inside, without leaving a mark anyone could point to. She thought about the line between the two. She thought about Wong's hands resting flat on that document. She thought about the transmitter sitting underneath the table like a patient, hidden animal. She thought about the shoebox under her bed and the person in the photograph on that ID badge, and whether that person would recognize what she had become. She picked up the tray. She steadied her breathing. She walked back in. She entered the room the same way she always did. Quietly, without announcement. The kind of entrance that registered as movement rather than presence. A door opening, a tray appearing, nothing that required acknowledgement. The meeting had moved forward in her absence. Wong was speaking in a low, even tone, his pen resting beside the document but not yet touching it. The negotiators listened with the careful, composed expressions of men performing patience. The one with the earpiece had his hands folded on the table. His fingers were very still. Noelani moved to the serving station. She lifted the fresh pot and began the short walk around the table, filling cups from left to right the way she had been trained. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was measured. From the outside, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a young woman doing a simple job in a room full of important people who would not remember her name. She reached Wong's end of the table. She told herself it would be controlled, a quiet lean, a few words beneath the level of the conversation, clean and brief, the way she had always been trained to operate, minimum exposure, maximum precision. She had done harder things than this. She had sat in rooms with far higher stakes and kept her hands from shaking through sheer force of practice. But practice belongs to the person you used to be. Her hands gave way without warning, not a gradual tremor, but a single, sudden failure of grip, as though something inside her had made the decision before she did. The teacup left her fingers. It hit the edge of the table on its way down, and then met the stone floor with a sound that was far too loud for its size. The room stopped. Not gradually, all at once. Wong's pens stayed where it was. The negotiators looked up. The two guards near the door straightened by half an inch. The silence that followed the sound was a different quality from the silence that had existed before it, charged, questioning, waiting to understand what had just happened. Noelani did not look at the floor. She did not say sorry. Both of those things would have been the correct response for the person she was pretending to be, and she was finished pretending, at least for the next 10 seconds. She looked directly at Wong. He was already looking at her, not with irritation, with the sharp, assessing attention of a man who had survived long enough to know that unexpected things were rarely accidents. She crouched down slowly, reaching for the broken pieces the way any careful member of staff would, and as she did, she brought herself level with his seated position, close enough. She kept her eyes on the porcelain fragments and her voice below the surface of the room. She spoke 4 words in Korean, quiet, clean, and precisely pronounced. The Korean she had spent 8 months learning in a government language program for a job she no longer had. They are listening now. She did not look at his face when she said it, but she felt the change in him the way you feel a shift in air pressure, something contracting, recalibrating, becoming very still in a way that was entirely different from his stillness before. She collected the largest pieces of the broken cup. She straightened up. She gave a short, respectful bow toward the table in general, the kind that asked for nothing and explained nothing. Then she turned and walked to the door at the same pace she had entered. She did not look back, but she heard it, the single quiet breath Wong took before he spoke again, slower than before, more deliberate. The room had changed. He had understood. The corridor was cold in the way that stone buildings are cold, not biting, but settled, as though the chill had been there long enough to become part of the structure. Noelani stood with her back against the wall beside the door, the broken pieces of the teacup wrapped in a cloth in her hand, and she listened. She was good at listening. She had always been good at it. It was the skill that had defined her, not the technical training, not the certifications, but the fundamental ability to hear what was actually being said beneath the surface of what was spoken. Wong's voice reached her through the door, low and even. To anyone passing, it would have sounded unchanged, but she had spent the last 14 months hearing that voice move through this estate, directing staff, taking calls, receiving reports, and she heard the difference immediately. It was subtle, a slight slowing of his sentences, a new deliberateness in the way he chose his words, the way a man speaks when he is building something rather than simply communicating. The warmth, which had been professional and measured before, was gone. What replaced it was harder, cleaner. It reminded her of a technique she had learned in her 2nd year of training. You did not shut down a compromised channel. You used it. You fed it exactly what you wanted the other side to receive, and then you watched to see how fast it moved and where it went. It told you the route. It told you the reach. It told you, if you were patient enough, exactly who was on the other end. Wong was being patient. She heard him cite a figure, a number large enough to matter, specific enough to be convincing, and wrong in a way that only someone with access to the real documents would ever catch. A moment later, a name. She didn't recognize it, which meant it didn't exist. Then a location, stated casually as part of a broader sentence, the kind of detail that would mean nothing unless you were listening for it specifically. He was building a false picture, brick by careful brick, and somewhere outside these walls someone was receiving it and believing it. Noelani counted the minutes without looking at her watch. It was a habit. Her instructor had made them practice it until it became automatic. Time is information, he used to say. Always know how much of it is passing. 11 minutes and 40 seconds after she had walked out of that room, something changed. She couldn't see it, but she heard the shift in the meeting's rhythm, a pause that was half a beat too long, a subtle adjustment in the seating sounds, the specific quality of silence that falls when someone in a room has just received unexpected information and is trying not to show it. Wong's voice stopped entirely for 3 seconds. Then he spoke 2 short sentences, formal, final. The meeting was over. What followed happened quickly and without noise, which somehow made it worse. Measured footsteps, a brief exchange she couldn't fully hear, the guards' voices low and directional, a door, not the one she was standing beside, but one further down the hall, opening and closing with a sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence. Then nothing. The room emptied in stages until the corridor itself felt emptied. Noelani stayed where she was. She didn't move toward the door or away from it. She simply stood in the cold quiet and let the reality of the last 12 minutes settle over her. It was done. Wong had seen it. The mole had been identified and removed as efficiently and quietly as the transmitter had been placed, professionally, without spectacle, in a language of controlled action that she recognized and respected. She had done the right thing. She knew that. She believed it completely. And still, when she finally looked down at her hands, they were shaking, not from fear of what might happen next, but from the release of 3 years of something she had been holding so tightly she had forgotten it had weight. She pressed her back against the wall and let them shake. The summons came through the estate manager, delivered in the same quiet, neutral tone he used for everything. Would she please come to Mr. Wong's private study when she was ready? The words were polite. The meaning was not a request. She folded the cloth in her hands, set it on the kitchen counter, and went. The study was at the end of the east wing, behind a door that was heavier than it looked. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, not for decoration, she could tell, but actually used, the spines worn and the order practical rather than arranged for appearance. A single lamp was lit on the desk. The rest of the room held the kind of darkness that felt intentional. Wong was seated behind the desk when she entered. He did not look up immediately. He finished reading whatever was in front of him, set it aside with one hand, and then looked at her with the same steady, unhurried attention she had seen him give the document before the meeting began. He did not gesture to the chair across from him. She stood. She kept her hands at her sides and her breathing even, and she let him look, because there was nothing else to do. He was studying her the same way she had studied the transmitter, working from the edges inward, building a picture from small details, deciding what he was actually looking at before he committed to a conclusion. The silence lasted long enough to be deliberate. Then he spoke, in English, which told her something on its own. "How does a maid," he said, his voice carrying no particular emphasis, "recognize a Class 3 surveillance transmitter on site?" The question sat in the air between them, clean, direct, unanswerable with anything less than the truth. She had known it was coming. She had known it since the moment she walked out of the meeting room, and she had spent the time since then making a quiet, private decision about how she would answer it. She had considered her options with the same methodical honesty she had applied to everything else tonight. A lie would not hold, not in front of this man, in this room. So she told him the truth, all of it. She told him her name, her full name, not the shortened version on her name tag. She told him her former clearance level and the division she had worked in. She described her specialty in plain language, the identification and analysis of surveillance equipment and the behavioral patterns of operatives in the field. She told him about the operation she had been running 3 years ago, a signals investigation into a foreign-linked corruption network inside a domestic intelligence unit. She told him how close she had been to completing it. And then she told him what happened, the framing, the false evidence, the testimony of a colleague who she later understood had been paid to give it, the speed with which her clearance was revoked and her access terminated, the way her name moved from an asset to a liability in the space of a single week, the legal costs that followed, and the debt, and the room she rented because it was the smallest acceptable space she could find, and the uniform on the back of the door, and 3 years of making herself invisible in the hope that whoever had done it would decide she was no longer worth watching. She said the name of the intelligence unit responsible. She said it clearly, without hesitation, because she had never once doubted it. Then she stopped, because that was everything. There was nothing left to explain or qualify or soften. Wong had not moved during any of it. He had not shifted in his chair or changed his expression or looked away from her face. He had simply listened, completely, without interruption, in a way that very few people had ever listened to her. It was the kind of listening that took something seriously. The room was quiet for a long time after she finished, long enough that she became aware again of the lamp on the desk and the weight of her own feet on the floor, and the fact that her hands at her sides were finally still. Wong looked at her for another moment, then he reached across the desk and moved the second chair slightly toward her, a small, unhurried gesture that nevertheless changed everything about the room. "Sit down," he said. 3 weeks passed the way difficult weeks do, slowly on the surface, with too much happening underneath. Noelani returned to her shifts. She folded linen. She polished surfaces that were already clean. She carried trays from one room to another and refilled things that did not need refilling, and moved through the estate with the same quiet efficiency she had spent 3 years perfecting. From the outside, nothing had changed. Wong did not summon her again. He did not acknowledge her in the corridors. When their paths crossed, briefly, incidentally, the way they always had, his eyes moved past her the way they always had before the night of the meeting. She was furniture again. She was air. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she had not expected anything different. But the waiting had a texture to it now that it hadn't had before. It pressed against the inside of her chest at quiet moments, during the long bus ride home, in the half-darkness before sleep, in the specific silence of the linen room where the only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the soft movement of her own hands. She had told someone the truth about herself for the first time in 3 years, and then she had gone back to pretending she was someone else entirely, and the distance between those two things was wider than she had expected. She stopped checking the brown envelopes on the kitchen counter. There was nothing in them that could help her now. On a Tuesday morning, 22 days after the meeting, she came back to her room after an early shift and found a sealed case file on her bed. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The window was closed. The door had been locked, she was certain of it. There was no sign that anyone had been inside. Whoever had placed it there had done so without leaving a trace, which told her more about Wong's reach than anything she had observed inside the estate. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The first pages were surveillance logs from the night of the meeting, time-stamped, detailed, professionally compiled, cross-referenced in the margins with documents she recognized as belonging to her own old case files. Files that were supposed to be sealed, files that had her clearance number printed at the top next to the name of the intelligence unit that had taken everything from her. She turned the pages slowly. Internal communications from inside that unit, emails between senior officers, written in the clipped, careful language of people who knew what they were doing was being recorded and didn't care. Financial transfer records, numbers and account codes and dates that aligned, precisely, with the timeline of her own dismantling. Then an audio transcript, a recorded confession from the agent who had given testimony against her, sitting in a room somewhere, in front of someone she couldn't identify, saying the words she had known for 3 years were lies, saying who had paid him, saying how much, saying that he was sorry, in the thin, self-serving way of people who are only sorry once the weight becomes too heavy to carry alone. She set that page down carefully. The last item in the file was a photograph, black and white, slightly grainy, taken from a distance. 2 men shaking hands outside a building she didn't immediately recognize. She studied the first face, then the second. She knew them both. The director of the intelligence unit that had framed her, and the man identified in Wong's post-meeting report as the leader of the syndicate that had planted the transmitter beneath the conference table. They were not strangers. They had never been strangers. The operation that had destroyed her career 3 years ago and the operation she had uncovered 3 weeks ago were not 2 separate stories. They were the same story, the same hands, the same network. She had been removed because she had been getting close to something much larger than she understood at the time. She sat with that knowledge for a long moment, let it settle, let it become real. At the very bottom of the file, beneath everything else, was a single sheet of plain paper, an address in the city, a time, 2 days from now, 10 in the morning. No signature, no explanation. None was needed. She closed the file, she placed her hand flat on the cover, and sat in the quiet of her small room, the bare walls, the kettle, the shoebox under the bed, and for the first time in 3 years she did not feel like someone waiting for her life to begin again. She felt like someone with somewhere to be. She did not wear the uniform. That was the first decision, and it was a small one, but it didn't feel small when she made it. She stood in front of the narrow wardrobe in her room that morning and looked at the black dress and white apron hanging on the back of the door, pressed and ready, the way they always were, and she left them where they were. She put on dark trousers and a simple shirt and the clean charcoal blazer she had kept folded at the bottom of the wardrobe for 2 years without a clear reason. She had told herself she was keeping it for practicality. She understood now that she had been keeping it for this. She pulled her hair back the way she always did, but differently. Not scraped back tight to disappear, not arranged to take up as little space as possible, but pinned back with intention. The distinction was invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. To her, it was the difference between hiding and choosing. She picked up the case file. She left the room. The estate felt different when she was not in uniform. The same stone floors, the same heavy doors, the same controlled silence, but she moved through it differently, and it received her differently, in the subtle way that spaces respond to the energy a person brings into them. The security guard at the side entrance looked up when she arrived. He held her gaze for a moment before nodding her through. She took the stairs to the east wing without being escorted. Wong was standing at the window of his study when she entered, his back to her, looking out at the grounds the way she had seen him look at documents, with full attention, reading something others might have seen as simply a view. He did not turn around immediately. She waited, and this time the waiting did not feel like powerlessness. It felt like patience, which was a different thing entirely. When he turned, he looked at her, not the way he had looked at her in the corridor for 14 months, past her, through her, but directly, with the same focused clarity he had given her words on the night she told him the truth. He spoke without preamble, which she had come to understand was simply how he operated. He told her that for years his organization had moved through the world with a confidence that had made it careless. He had trusted structures that were compromised. He had put the right information in the wrong rooms and paid the price in ways he was still calculating. What had happened 3 weeks ago was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper blindness, and he was not a man who treated symptoms without addressing what was underneath them. He needed someone trained to see what others missed, someone who understood the architecture of surveillance, how it was built, how it was hidden, and how it was dismantled, someone with the technical knowledge and the professional discipline to build a counterintelligence function that actually worked. He also needed, he said, someone with a personal reason to make sure the people behind that transmitter were fully and permanently exposed, not just removed from his orbit, exposed, legally, publicly, without the possibility of quiet reassignment or convenient retirement. The role was head of internal counter-surveillance. The resources were his. The case against the intelligence unit that had destroyed her career would be built in parallel, with his full legal support and the evidence already assembled in the file she was holding. He said clearly that this was not charity. His organization benefited, she recovered what was taken from her. The interests were aligned, and alignment was the only foundation he trusted. He stopped speaking. The room was quiet. Noelani looked down at her hands. They were steady. Completely, unremarkably steady, not through effort, not through the practiced suppression of 3 years of fear, but simply because the shaking had nothing left to hold on to. The thing she had been bracing against had either arrived or passed, and what remained was just her, standing in a room being asked to do the work she was built for. She looked up. "Yes," she said. The operations room was on the 2nd floor of a building she had never entered before the role began. It was dim by design, better for the screens, better for focus, with a long table and 8 chairs and a display wall that showed live data feeds in quiet, scrolling columns. 6 months later, Noelani stood at the head of that table. Wong's inner circle was seated around it, men who had spent their careers being the most dangerous presence in any room they entered. They were watching her. She pointed to the screen, she walked them through the live debrief with the steady, exact language of someone who had spent 6 months rebuilding the instincts she had once been made to feel ashamed of. Her voice did not rise, it did not waver, it moved through the room with the particular authority of someone who knew, not believed, not hoped, but knew exactly what she was talking about. She did not look at her hands. She did not need to. She was not furniture. She was not air. She was not the woman in the small room with the bare walls and the unopened envelopes and the shoebox under the bed. She was not invisible. She was essential, and the room knew it, and so did she.